internet.
No.
That's a no. We've already
It
said,
means the AI can start pulling your voice and impersonating
although
you.
I have to say, is that a real beard? Because dude, that is extra. That is something else.
You know what I found being like Zoom calls and even work calls, it's not this dark. People think I'm like putting it looks darker on camera, but it's light brown.
That's
I mean,
awesome.
But this looks black. Like
it's
it's
Yeah,
not
pretty
that
it
dark, I
does have
promise.
vaguely like Bert and Ernie vibes.
I it looks horrible, actually.
Grecian formula, man. Like,
It's not that dark, I promise. I promise.
Andrew and I just wish that we had that much pigment still in our facial hair.
that's right.
Uh,
Well, my former employer popped into the store to say hi today, and the first thing she did is go up to me and she's like, look at the gray in your beard. So anyway, good times. Well, Sky, thanks for joining us. Yeah, you don't have to, you can fade into the background. But yeah, this is, that's a good point. We're just going to take a photo quickly to highlight the fact that this is the smallest KWM virtual tasting ever. Not including the one person also watching on Facebook. Maybe we'll get one or two more. If they only knew how much Glenlivet we had here, James,
I mean,
it's a lot of Glenlivet.
yeah, it's 200 years worth, isn't it?
It's more than that. Like if I go back to the
Yeah, because
description,
like the youngest one is 40 years old. Well,
well,
other than the 04.
other than the 04. Yeah, I don't even know if I don't think there's a total on here, but like everything we were sampling is from 1980 or like earlier. Like, so 1980 is the second youngest vintage other than the one 2004. So think about that. That's got like, let's just say 40 plus years times 6. We're over 250 for sure. We're in the like
Well, yeah,
275
this
range.
tasting, really, if you think about it, the fact that we have this kind of vertical, it did require, like, a lot of people probably just assume, like, oh, Gordon MacPhail has verticals of Glenlivet kind of sitting around. I mean, you just grabbed one of them.
Yeah.
But it actually required a little bit of luck to make this happen.
And a bit of delay, like delaying
Well, and
tactics or
sourcing like the 79 and the 78 required some work. Yeah.
shenanigans. Yeah. Well, so we might as well say what we're doing. So for those of you who stumble upon this on Facebook or on YouTube at some point in time, this is a virtual version of the Glenlivet tasting that we did as part of the Rare and Old Whisky Weekend in Calgary at Kensington Wine Market. That tasting was hosted by Richard Urquhart. Thank God we didn't even think of asking him to co-host this one.
Oh my gosh.
Although maybe he would have just enjoyed the pleasure of having a chat with 3 other people. You never know. But it would have been late.
Might have.
So this was part of the weekend. It was a masterclass tasting done at the store. The reason we did it is that there were some bottlings of Glenlivet that we had at the store that were part of the release of the Gordon MacPhail Glenlivet 80-year-old, which was for about 6 months the oldest whiskey ever bottled until Macallan bottled an 81-year-old Gordon MacPhail. And I think, James, like at the time, we didn't really know what to do with them. There was only 3 bottles of most of them. And it kind of I kind of just kept putting off bringing them in because I wasn't really sure what to do with them. And I think partly bias-wise, it was like Glenlivet. I just wasn't getting that excited. Like, how exciting is Glenlivet? And we had this
Well, this
weekend
is the way to
planned.
make it exciting.
It
Let's
is a way to make it
chill.
exciting. And once we started actually thinking about it, and as you said, pulling together the pieces to put together like a really cool vertical of Glenlivet, like 1980, 1979, 1978, 1977, 1976, 1975, like a 6 vintage vertical of Glenlivet. Like Glenlivet doesn't even do that kind of shit. So it ended up being a really cool
There might be
tasting
years here they don't even have in their own stock.
for sure. And so yeah, we did it at the weekend. It was a surprise hit. I think it was the first tasting to sell out, which really blew my mind as well. But I guess maybe that was because I wasn't remembering or wasn't putting in context. This isn't just Glenlivet, it's Gordon MacPhail Glenlivet in their casks, and they rarely disappoint. Anything we should say, or should we just dive into this and get rolling?
I'm comfortable doing that.
Okay. Glenlivet's 200 years old as of this year.
Good point.
Yeah. George Smith, who my famously walked around his distilleries with two pistols on his hip, a gift from the landlord because people wanted to kill him.
Seriously?
Because he took out a license to distill legally. And this was right after the Small Stills Act of 1823. And it's why you see like Macallan and all these distilleries opening up in 1824 because they changed the rules. They made it easier. But all these bootleggers were pissed off at him because he'd sold out and gone legit. So there was death threats against him, and the landlord gave him a pair of pistols. Now, where I think this is humorous is that I imagine him in a kilt, walking around his distillery, Old West style, with a couple of pistols on his hip.
I mean, it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
I like to think if you went back in time and could actually like go and meet and drink with these people that ran distilleries like in the early 1800s, we wouldn't last 5 minutes.
No. And then they'd probably be like, why do you want to talk to me? Like,
Yeah.
why are you here? No context for where that industry would go when he started that thing out. But
Kidding.
largest
That's certainly
distillery,
not luxury.
largest malt distillery in Scotland, tied with Glenfiddich, 21 million liters a year, which is an obscene amount of whiskey to make in 1 year. But decent spirit. So James, 2004 is where we're starting here.
Yep.
And if this was not knowing, if you were doing this blind and not knowing what was following, that 2004 has got a lovely little nose to it.
Well, and it kind of, I think, speaks to like bridging the gap between the Glenlivet we know on the shelf and the Gordon MacPhail story, because it kind of just feels like, you know, what we would do if we could get our hands on sub 20-year Glenlivet and bring it to the world. Like that's kind of what this feels like.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
this was released obviously as part of that 80-year-old kind of festivities.
Mm-hmm.
I think they wanted to specifically have kits that they could go out and do promotion with. And at the end, Richard kind of told me, like, look, we have a few kind of extras. Like, do you want some? And I was like, yeah, I definitely do. So I think we only got 3 bottles of, I think we got 6 bottles of this one.
It might have even been a dozen. I mean,
It may have been.
I think the
There
two
was a
young
2003 as well.
the two young ones we got a bit more of. The other ones, there was just 3 bottles. It's not like this is not going to hold up well against the rest of the lineup, but it's very pleasant.
Yeah.
I think it shows you the Glenlivet DNA. It's clean, floral, malty, some gentle fruit notes, apple, and maybe a bit of citrus.
Well, the first thing I notice is, I mean, I was talking about a whiskey that I had earlier today that is very well known and desirable. And this absolutely holds up to that whiskey. So
Would that distillery start with the letter M?
no.
Or an S? Like,
That's a closer guess. That's a closer guess.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. It doesn't rhyme with Shmen Moshe. That's my hint.
Oh, right. I should have clued into what this was because you were literally telling me about it before we got rolling here. But anyway, it's from a certain peninsula that looks like the shaft of
Yeah.
human anatomy if Aaron were to be the other part of said anatomy.
Yep.
Only in Scotland.
Yeah, this is a style of whiskey that I know like no one talks about, but like you have to have bottles like this on your back bar.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just fruity, it's approachable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't buy this anymore, unfortunately.
No.
However, and this is not a sales bit for the Glenlivet 80, even though there is still one of those available. But we've got a 24-year-old boutique bottling that is Glenlivet that is kind of in this style. I'd say it's going a little bit more tropical than this.
Yes.
But
Which this one, if it had another 8 years, probably would come out around the same.
100%. Like 100%.
I think I have one sitting right here, Andrew.
Oh, very good.
I know it's not my brand, but hey, we're all family.
Hey, a banger is a banger, man. And when it's a good
Yeah.
price, like anyway, uh, it's a big distillery. It's going to produce a lot. It's unsurprising that they were willing to sell to companies like Gordon MacPhail for a long time. They were focused on blends. Other companies, even if it was under contract and they couldn't declare exactly what it was, but yeah, that's a nice, fresh, easy drinking whiskey. I've not given the Glenlivet, a proper chance recently, and I probably should. It's been a long time since I've, been through the distillery range, but what's making me think of this is that I've done it with Glenfiddich in the last 3 or 4 years. And I've been impressed by like how good their 12-year-old is, how good their 15-year-old is. They're all way under proof,
Yeah.
but they're well-made whiskeys. They're worthy of respect. I might not stock them in my store all the time, but I have respect for what they do and the craft that's there. And even compared to some other, mainstream distilleries, I think the quality's there. And
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see if it's the same with the Glenlivet line because there has to be a reason why it sells well, and it can't just be brand because it's not Macallan.
No.
It doesn't
Right.
have that
That
strength.
would be a bad assumption.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Yeah, I think
that
we all
was
just wish that there was like a bottling in the range that kind of tickled what we're looking for, right?
yeah.
That's
But I
that's
mean, they're not making their whiskey for you and I, James, or even
no, it's true. No, I have
um,
this fight with people all the time about Ben Romick 10 and 15.
the irony of that though is that like I would be quite happy drinking Ben Romick 10 and 15, but you're right. They're not making it for the people that like eagerly go online and purchase like more like 2000 vintage single casks and stuff like that the second it appears online because they're looking at other things. Anyway, that was lovely.
Yeah,
We're
I
gonna
should mention too, just my own kind of a personal note. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that have this story in Canada. My kind of introduction to Gordon MacPhail was these like J.G. Smith bottlings, basically the distillery label.
Mhm,
And like I'm sure lots of people have this kind of same process they went through. Like I was working for Bruichladdich at the time, and like I couldn't process what this meant. Like how were they doing this Glenlivet, but like under this weird label? And there was
mhm,
kind of like in BC at the time, there wasn't people around to kind of explain that properly. And the internet wasn't a great resource for that type of information.
mhm,
So it was kind of this like mystery. It was priced really well, 21 years old. Like I went through a lot of bottles of that because I was just like I thought I had discovered something
mhm.
that was like this secret.
Well, I mean, for a long time it was. I mean, you're going back to the period when, Gordon MacPhail was perhaps, if we're being charitable, drastically underpriced.
Yeah.
And then, you could get 30, 40-year-old whiskeys for under $300-400 often,
Right.
and very good quality. And those Glenlivets, those Smith's Glenlivet, were pretty awesome. And the label, I mean, looking back now, like I miss the label on those bottlings,
Yeah, I do too. Same with the Glen Grant one.
but they were pretty budget.
Hmm.
Uh, and by today's standards, they probably wouldn't get people too excited. But yeah, those are some pretty cool whiskeys.
That's
Um,
awesome.
I'm just trying to pull the bottle up here. This one, uh, I'm pretty sure sold out after the tasting. Granted, there was only 2 bottles for sale, and we poured one. Uh, the other 2 sold to people right after the tasting. Well, I'm looking here, right here. What have we got for ABV? 42.6. So this is the one we're looking for. So I'm on to Whiskey Base. We've got a refill American Okagi, 40 years old, distilled 1980, bottled in 2020. So James, I guess 6 of the whiskeys that we're trying tonight are effectively before your time. Is that fair to say?
Like in terms of when I was working for Gordon MacPhail?
No, I mean
Oh, before I was born.
before you were born.
I know. Yes. Yeah, I'm an 81 baby, so
Yeah.
um yeah. I mean, I'm assuming they have some 81 Glenlivet in the warehouse still.
Well, I mean, we better get on that.
Yeah.
So there you go. When you get the private collection, you get a nice box, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, I would put in a vote for that as being the nicest presentation of any whiskey packaging in the market. I know there's lots of good options, but it's right up there.
But I think what's nice about it is that it's sort of classy. It's not over the top. It's not unnecessarily complicated or cute.
Yeah.
On a completely separate note, which, as you know, I like to wander down. Have you seen the Ardbeg Y2K packaging?
No.
It's like a plastic box thing. And it's funny because you get very different reactions to it. You get like Kurt, who's an old school whiskey guy, and he's like repulsed. It's like, what is this? But then you get
I feel like
non-whiskey.
he's out on Ardbeg now.
He could be.
Maybe.
No, although he's quite keen on the new 17. Um,
Really?
but that and it actually does show very well despite the low ABV. But anyway, my point is, like, my buddy who's not into whiskey at all, other than just drinking it, saw the box and he's like, "This is cool. What is it?" And I was like, "Oh, like we poured it for tasting. Do you want it for your son?" Which reminds me, it's still in my office. I got to give it to him. Like, it looks cool from an aesthetic standpoint, but if you're a whiskey guy, it's kind of, you know, what is it?
I'm
So
looking
those
it up right
G&M
now.
packages are very well done, and I hope they don't change it for some reason in the next year or two because they feel it needs a refresh, because I
Oh,
think it is very classic.
okay, I'm looking at it right now. That is a little bit weird.
It is a little bit weird.
Hmm.
What are you going to do? All right,
This
so
is
on.
not weird at all. Whatever's
This
in my
is
glass right now.
this
Oh
is
my
very
word.
decadent, and I might say not far off what you would get from those Smith's Glenlivet bottlings, because they were
Totally.
mostly in that 43% range. Oh, some nice pineapple tones in there. I mean, it's quite tropical. I think what's nice
Yeah.
here is you've got a refill American oak cask. It's allowing the spirit to shine through. So you're allowing those tropical tones to develop and come out.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to love here. One of the kind of notes I know that didn't really come up when we did this tasting the first time is that like all this spirit is kind of like really what you could consider the modern era
Mhm.
of distillate. But man, 40 years just like and it's just so alive still and vibrant.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Like
one of the
well
things
stored in a good cask, right?
good cask, probably not moved. I mean, that's the other thing about Gordon MacPhail and their cask management is, you know, they fill the casks and they sort of just leave them to rest for a long time. They don't move them very often, especially the older ones.
Yeah.
And, you know, 40 years of age is very easy to start getting into some of those more bitter tannic notes from the wood. And
Yeah,
there's
that is
not
not
even
a
a
problem
trace
with
of that.
this. I mean, this is just so gorgeous.
Well, I think they could have left this if it wasn't for the ABV.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So one of the things, and actually I think I learned this at Gordon MacPhail, was that when you go to the bottling process, well, not even just the bottling, disgorging the spirit from the cask, you're going to lose strength, which makes sense because you're essentially running it through a venturi. You might as well be like,
Yeah, like
uh,
you're almost like you're changing the pressure, which is going to cause some evaporation.
and sucking it through a hose
Yeah.
that's textured. So it's like rippling through this hose. And then it's going into a container. And then you put it in that until you suck it through a hose again to run it through filters of some level or another and put it into bottling. And you lose just in that bottling stage when you go from the tank into the bottles 1% to like 1% evaporation. So if you're at 40.0 and you go straight to bottling, you run the risk of dropping below 40%. So all of this, I think, has to be factored into the strength. Or James, I can see, I think, where your head's going on this. Perhaps they don't think about this enough. And if we were to actually test things, 40% whiskeys might actually be 39 point something.
Yeah, or a certain distillery I worked for in ages past that is a little bit more commercial than what I work for now. I know for a fact that when they bottled these old bottles, they would sometimes have like old spirit that was high proof that they would add like literally bottle by bottle just to make sure that that didn't happen.
Shady. Oh well, as long as it's older than what you claim on the label.
Yep,
But but if
exactly.
but if it's a single cask, it's
Yeah.
really not a single
Yeah, I
cask.
remember when I visited said distillery, they it was a very memorable moment because they put us upstairs in this lounge and they had like a private kitchen there where they did events for their high roller customers. And they said we could have anything we wanted to try out of the shelf, and it was filled with underproof bottles that had like been rejected off the line. And like there was some wild stuff in there. Lots of bottles from the 60s. Like I didn't even get to taste everything I wanted to taste, and because we were there for like 45 minutes. It was pretty pretty cool.
Would this be a Northern Highlandish distillery?
You yeah, not Balblair.
Say no more. Say no more.
And
Uh,
definitely not Chinnik.
well, that 1980 is pretty nice. James,
Yeah,
that was
I would never ever get tired of drinking that.
no, that was the year your folks were thinking about having you.
So the
Uh,
year my parents were married.
yeah. Oh, are you what they would have called back in the days a holy child? Like, did you come into the world within less
Like
than
a
1 year of
scandal.
marriage? No, one, no, if so this was one of the, I remember there was this thing in like the Middle Ages where if a child was born within 12 months of marriage, even if it was like 5 months,
Yeah.
it was deemed like a blessing on the marriage. It was like a holy child.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would have been 13 months, so clearly not that holy.
Well, yeah.
Oh
Who's
well.
who's counting? Who's
Yeah.
counting? All right. So we're going to move on to 1979, which is a meaningful year for me because that's the year my brother was brought into the world on my birthday.
Yeah.
Um, forever making my birthday. I suppose I never got a birthday all on my own. I had to share all of them, but that's not so
I
bad.
didn't know that.
Yeah, Irish twins, exactly a year apart, nonetheless.
That's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, which is pretty crazy. So James, we're going on to an archives bottling of Glenlivet here.
Yes.
I'm going to put it up on the screen. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the range? Because these are a little unusual.
Yeah, I think when they came into market, I think the perception was that maybe this was kind of like a B tier range that was being brought out from the private collection series. But the truth is that these would have, in any other world, been bottled as private collections for basically about twice the price. But there was a point when these were bottled where they actually had some issues sourcing glassware. So it gets a little bit complicated because you're doing the math and it's like, oh, well, it's bottled on October 2018. But the
Mhm.
tricky thing is that some of these things were bottled. You know, if you look at the outturn number, and I think this one is, how many bottles was there? 37.
Yeah.
So they had a bunch of these casks that were like short fill, and I think they just dumped them in glass that was around because they just absolutely needed to bottle them immediately
Mhm.
because they were draining. And the idea was that they would find their way to into the private collection range at some point,
Mhm.
and it just kind of never happened. And then during COVID, they decided to instead just ship these that were in bottle because they had these lying around and sell them as these unique archives range, but at a massive discount.
Mhm.
So it's a good idea. I mean, really, but I think what's weird is that we got four of them, and I think this Glenlivet, three of them were quite good.
Mhm.
None of them was like an absolute home run. I wouldn't say, and one of them was probably over oaked, which was the Linkwood. Although I know some people that absolutely love that. But
Yeah, that Linkwood was a bit
yeah, but the
overcooked.
Glen Grant 65, and then there was, of course, we still have the Glenbergie. 67, which is showing great. And I mean, this one has tons of character, but it's
Well,
very oxidized, like very. Like you can
well, I
tell it
mean,
was a low cask.
all three of us know a certain gentleman whose initials are AL. We don't need to say anything more than that. And I think he struggled with this, even though it's his birth year, because I don't think it was quite as sherried as he wanted. And it has a little bit of that, like it's got a bit of that profile, but I mean, it's American oak, so it's not going to be sherried, but I mean, it's quite dark.
Yeah. But yeah, lots of just like it's almost like really, really overripe apple. Like there's almost like a sense of caramel or like toffee on top of it. There's a hint of cidery kind of notes, which again is that like oxidative.
The cider note's a good one. It's very, once I get into it, it's very reminiscent of bourbon, but without being over the top. I mean, if,
Without the raw wood.
yeah, so I'm thinking like older bourbons, like the Michter's 20 or, happy releases, but without that astringent, like, and I mean, Michter's isn't fair because I don't find it's quite as heavily oaked, but certainly with like the Pappies and some of those older bourbons, they're really getting into that bitter oak. And this doesn't have it. It's just it's got those bourbon tones, but with like tropical fruits, apple crumble, like fresh cream. There's something also like it's like a floral soap.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, coming from the 80, which is so elegant, and then
Mhm,
this thing like has some
mhm.
twists and turns to it. It's this like it's got a lot of character.
It's nutty on the palate, quite toasty. The tropical fruit is really trying to fight against that like classic ex bourbon note,
Yeah,
and it's not really clear who's coming out on top.
yeah.
If I had a tasting note for this that was like a little esoteric, it would be like a 1980s like action figure, wrestling action figure, like fresh out of the package.
I think I know exactly what you mean.
Like one of those stretchy, like wrestling action figures.
Yeah, I'm sure the plastics they were using back then were probably like leaching chemicals into our fingers.
Super off gassing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Very,
yeah,
you know what? The nose on this for me is like 9 out of 10. The palate's like a 7.5. It's good,
yeah.
but as
Which
you
all the
said,
archives bodlings have that element to them. They all nose like spectacular
mhm,
and they drink. It feels like there's like that one thing missing.
mhm. So you're saying Stuart Urquhart just wouldn't give it a private collection score?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it does make you wonder, like, why weren't they released as private collection right at the time of bottling? And there probably was some thought to that, right? Like
But
they
still,
probably were scored a half step below. But
how
again,
many
price more than accounts for that.
how many companies though would die to bottle this?
Oh my gosh. Right? Think of it this way, even Andrew. Like, okay, so this was 39 years old. And like how many companies even would trust that they could create something like this, even with the requisite care?
Mhm,
Right? Like
yeah,
there would be a lot of companies would probably think, I don't know if we can.
mhm, yeah. Well, very few out there bottling. I mean, outside of Gordon MacPhail, Signatory, there's very few independent ballers that are regularly bottling
Yeah.
late 30s, let alone 40-year-old spirits. Uh, I think we should move on to the greatest vintage in history, if that's okay with everyone. By which I mean James, myself, and our one guest, other than the people watching on Facebook, who are happy to have there as well.
What's the one bottle of 1978 whiskey in your collection that you're like that you really treasure?
Oh man, that's a good question. Um, the funny thing is I've got a 1968 Highland Park that I'm really looking forward to opening someday. It was the first expensive bottle that I ever bought. I bought it on my first trip to the distillery. This was back in the old days, James, and they gave me like a 50-pound credit to use in their visitor center. And I think the bottle was 350 pounds. So it was like, well, I really should buy this 1968. When am I going to get a chance to buy that? But as far as like,
Oh, past you was really smart.
yeah, as far as like my own vintage, you know, there's quite a few in there. Like I've actually got a bottle of this tucked away. I've got quite a few Glenfarclas family casks, most of which are fourth fill. So very tropical. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, maybe some 1978 Port Ellens that
Yeah.
I've not got a lot of. Maybe I've got a couple, like two bottles each of two different like Port Ellen releases that were from 78. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I've been lucky. I've had a front seat to this, and even when I got started 20 years ago, there, even if you didn't have any money, like 78 vintage stuff was affordable.
Yeah.
Not
Right, so
anymore.
this is the first sherried whiskey in the lineup.
It is. So I'll pop this up on the screen.
I remember when we
Unfortunately,
tasted through this
most,
the first time, that was kind of the takeaway. It's like it's kind of nice alternating in some ways between bourbon and sherry with these old whiskeys because it like recalibrates your palate a little bit.
Mhm. So like the 1980, this was bottled at 40 years of age, 44.5%, refill sherry hoggy. This is from before our current website, so hence why the
Yeah.
image is down here and not up there. But I don't even remember what this sold for. But I think it was around like $2,000.
Yeah, it was just under. I want to say you probably had it for like 1950 or 1850, and I know in BC it was about 2200. I
Mhm.
think there's still one single bottle for sale at the Angry Otter store in on 248th Street.
I think it's
So they
incredible
bought
that
three and they sold two of them, but there's still one left.
I think it's incredible that there's a store called the Angry Otter and that it has a 1978 Glenlivet in it. That's
Yeah, that
pretty
was
special.
the buyer at the time was our friend Roberto.
Oh, of
Yep.
course. Well, what do we think of this? This is definitely that richer, darker, you know.
Yeah. Well, the tasty note on this is so bang on. The rum-soaked raisins. Like it really reminds me of like when you're prepping to cook like a fruitcake, which I
See
don't know
that.
if you have any history of that in your family.
Well, my mom makes a great, you know, I know some people aren't big fans of Christmas cake. My mom makes a great one. She
Yeah, my grandma makes a great one.
soaks it in rum.
Yep. Yeah,
Um,
this is what that smell reminds me of big time.
did yours like age it, like wrap it in whatever that cloth was and then age it?
No, so what she would do is how they like to serve it is she would serve it, she would bake it when it was ready to be served. She would put it in a jar, so fill
Mhm.
the jar like halfway and like bake it kind of fresh to order and then put cold ice cream on top and then like maple syrup. So we
Mhm.
would have it almost like a dessert. But something that she kind of knew is that if you left them in the cellar in those jars for like 3 or 4 years, it improved in flavor. And
Yeah.
it absolutely was true.
Well, that's like my mom's mincemeat, same thing,
Yeah.
which she would make with actual, like if someone hunted an animal and was willing to give some, she'd put it in, or she'd go and get suet and use that instead. But this reminds me a little bit of like her mincemeat pie, which was both savory and sweet.
Yeah, interesting.
And it was the sort of thing where you could open a jar of it a year later and make a pie with it, and it was still
Yeah.
perfect.
By the way, shortbread does that too. If you leave it in the freezer for a year, it comes out
Really?
better. It comes out more like flaky and buttery.
Mm.
So yeah, my grandma on the other side, who has the UK descent, we would always be served like 1 year old shortbread at Christmas. So she'd always be making for the next year.
Have you ever had shortbread with whiskey icing on it?
No, but I'm gonna have to make that happen.
You're going to have to make it happen. One of the ladies in Calgary who's been a friend of mine and uh, one of my early whiskey customers, Dr. Jane, makes a very good whiskey icing to put on top of shortbread. And every year she'll mix it up. She'll make a different icing for the shortbread. But I remember the first year she did it was with Fettercairn Fior, which was quite interesting because it was like this peaty, spicy whiskey, and it made a really good. I think the most recent one she made was with Bowmore 25-year-old, a Bowmore 25-year-old icing sugar.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Did it pick up the fruit?
Oh yeah, and a little bit of the lavender from that particular bottling anyway. So, I mean, the interesting thing on this is that old school sherry style of whiskey.
Yeah, it's not very fruity.
No, it's not.
Like coming off the first two, which are like so fruity.
It's very
Like,
chocolatey.
yes. Yeah, like there's a lot of dried fruit, but it's like savory dried fruit.
Mm-hmm. I would even say there's a little bit of a meatiness to it as well.
Yep.
But it's soft. And I think that's the interesting element here is, and this goes back to that Gordon MacPhail style of sherry cask, is that it's not overpowering. It's got a nice balance to it, but it definitely has an earthy, meaty profile. And like, this has got to be Spanish oak. This can't be American oak sherry.
Oh, 100%. Right. Like it is the flavor profile is quite reminiscent of Spey malt in a lot of ways.
Well, it actually reminds me, we did this the other night with our This Is Not an Advent Calendar tasting. We had the Millstone 25-year in there that they bottled for Canada. And it has a little bit of that. And those are Oloroso Solera vat sherry casks. So, I mean, this has that like old sherry cask vibe to it.
Oh God, it really is lovely.
It is. Do I wish it was slightly more tropical? Yes, but
I was going to say if it had a twist of ripe fruit on the end, then it would be like off the charts.
It'd be an absolute banger if that was the case.
Well, you just have to put a dash of the 1980 into it.
Just do a little
and mix your own.
It might come to that, James. It might come to that before the end. Even a little bit of that 79 might do it some wonders.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move to the year I was conceived. My better half's vintage. So let me pull up the sheet on this one if I can find it. 1977. So I believe this was one of those ones. No, this is the most recent bottling. That's right. This is the one that's still available. The Private Collection 1977. 44 years old. So I believe this might even be the oldest in the lineup.
Yes. That's actually a good point. I never even thought of that.
Older even than the 1975 we're going to end on.
Yeah, this is still for sale. Right.
Yeah. So 44 years, it's refill American oak hogshead again with quite a bit of color. 45%. So all of these Glenlivets are finding their way down and really down into the 40s, aren't they? Except for that 1978.
Yeah, it does almost seem like there might be, like, at least with modern Glenlivet, there might be a bit of an expiry date.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, much more wood influence on here. I feel like the nose is a little bit shy.
It is, but I've got the benefit of the old school blender's glass here, and
yeah,
I mean this is going quite tropical again on the nose, but lots of toasted almonds, candied nut tones. There's something on there that reminds me of like a really good old-fashioned cocktail, like not an overly overbuilt one, but just one that's like precisely made, dialed in. You've got the whiskey, you've got the sugars, you've got that bit of orange in there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. You're right. And yeah, like sometimes when the bartender gets it right with the vermouth, where everything just like melds together. I sometimes wonder with stuff like this when we're comparing it to these bottles that have been, have a little bit of that bottle effect. I think it does serve to kind of open up the whiskey a little bit.
Mhm. You know, the funny thing you mentioned about that, James, is that even though like this has not been bottled very long compared to some of the others here, but
Yeah.
it does kind of have that a little bit of that like
Like it's
old
closed.
note on it. Going back now, I mean, this is the so far of what we've had is like the most perfumed, maybe other than the first whiskey, it's the most floral in the lineup so far.
Yeah, there's some very, very exotic like licoricey and like
Mhm,
toasted herbs. Like there's almost you might convince yourself that there was a hint of smoke.
mhm. But it's interesting because when you get to the palate, it does come across very oxidized.
Yeah.
It's possibly the most oxidized of all the whiskeys we've had in the range so far.
And what was the outturn again? It was also low, wasn't it?
Let me have a look at this again. Oh, I'm gonna have to zoom in, see if I
I
could.
think it's like less than 100 bottles.
Yeah, I'd have to go to Whiskey Base to check because it's not on our page here. Still very tasty,
Yeah.
quite bright, but yeah, a little on the oxidized side on the palate. I'm gonna actually look that detail up because I think that could be an interesting point here. So 1977, and we're at 45%. What does Whiskey Base say? Oh, that doesn't even bring it up. 1977.
Yeah, I love the this one to me has a lot of like dark fruits to it. Like it's it's almost like currant and like prune. It goes to show like some of that tropical fruit that is in the earlier like the 78 and 79. Like it
Mhm.
does serve to add an element of freshness that this maybe doesn't have as much.
Yeah, I mean,
Like this
it,
almost feels like it belongs with a cigar.
mhm. Well, it's a shame then that the other Alan didn't grab one of these.
Yeah.
Well, this bottle's not even on Whiskey Base, which is kind of funny, but I
This,
suppose,
yeah, this is a common thing with this would have been bottled just for the North American market. And that's kind of one of the flaws of whiskey base is that I think a lot of the most dedicated users are based in Europe.
yeah. Well, and I don't have time to go and check. What's the other one? There's a Whiskey Base rival out there now.
Oh, is there?
Um, yeah. Oh, you haven't seen this?
No, I'm genuinely shocked I don't know about this.
Next time I stumble upon their website, I'll look it up. But there is a rival trying to build a separate and different database of whiskeys.
Interesting.
Yeah, was
Hmm.
interesting indeed. All right,
Good
I'm
luck to
going
them, as Ralphie would say.
exactly. Good luck to them. All right, I'm doing one last thing. I'm checking the Glenlivet site to see if by any chance they have the 77 or the Glenfiddich or Gordon MacPhail site. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not on their site. So we don't know the outturn, James, unless you've got it in a
I'm gonna
map.
find it actually. Now that you say that, I do have a backup plan that I feel like might come in handy here. But yeah, just give me a minute to go through.
Yeah, no worries. Well, while you're doing that, I think maybe I'll start teeing into the 1976, um, which was one of the whiskeys that was released as part of that
Yes.
Glenlivet series to highlight the release of the well, the 80-year-old, the generation's 80-year-old. So here we go, 1976, sadly sold out, 45 years of age. So actually, James, I was wrong. The 77 is not the oldest. Um,
Okay, the way that it worked out.
just by bottling. So the next one we're on to, refill American oak again, which is a bit of a trend with these Glenlivets that we're having tonight, 43.9%. I'll put it up on screen. We haven't archived this yet, so I can still share the price, even though it's gone, which was $2,600. Not an inexpensive bottle, but for a 45-year-old bottle, not a bad price either. And sadly, this is the one where, and I don't know if it was the same with your sample kit, James. We have the smallest sample, so I have the least to work with here. But yeah, this is the 1976 Glenlivet. And continuing on that theme, this is another creamy, a little bit decadent, very fruity, tropical nose to it.
By the way, that 77 only outturned 46 bottles.
Jeez. Now, is there a chance there might be some shenanigans going on here, James, where they're bottling, say, 50, 60 bottles for a private client, and then the rest get put into...
I mean,
Could
it's
that be happening?
completely possible.
And by shenanigans, I mean, you know, maybe...
And that would also make sense why it would show up in an American stock list.
Right. People will ask less questions.
Oh man, we're back to the tropical.
Well, and it might have been your comment earlier, but this has got a nice shortbread note to it, and it's on the palate too. This is very buttery. Waxy.
Yeah, sometimes these very old American oak whiskeys, like the coconut flavor, kind of hits when it's in its 20s, but then kind of like evolves past that. But this still has a lot of like cream of coconut.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is when you compare this back to that whiskey we started with, the 2004, you can see similarities there
Oh
in the
yeah.
spirit. I mean,
yeah, to be honest, all these whiskeys, even the sherry one, like you can see the bones is the same. Like they do tie together. That's kind of was my biggest takeaway of this tasting was like the DNA of Glenlivet is like super clear as you go through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love your note of shortbread.
Little woodier
Yeah.
the second sip, but it's still very sweet. I think it's the shortbread with the icing sugar on it.
Yeah,
So
it almost comes
fruit
across
notes.
drying, but not quite, and that's what's lovely about it. Is it gets close without going over.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we've had, I mean, maybe the only one that's kind of been slightly over the hill so far was number 2, like the 79.
Yeah.
Curiously, everything that's followed has had a bit more of a youthful vibe to it. It's not
Yeah,
been
totally.
quite as, you know.
Well, I'm sure this 76 had the same problem that the 1980 did, which was, oh my gosh, we have to bottle this now or it's not going to make it.
Well, and yeah, good point. I mean, we've got another whiskey here now that's below 43, well, just above 43%, 43.9. You know, I guess this would be a good question to ask Richard, James. One of us should ask him at some point in the future. But when we think of the Gordon MacPhail portfolio, we think sherry. And I think we think sherry because they've got so many incredible whiskeys matured in sherry.
Yeah, it's over 60% of what they fill historically.
Yeah, they specify their own, like what their own sherry casks are in terms of the seasoning, the thickness of the stave. But everything we've had here from Glenlivet is almost everything has been ex-bourbon. And like, is that a conscious decision? Are they consciously filling Glenlivet in bourbon as opposed to sherry because they think that's what it'll mature in better?
Yes. I mean, usually they always say they want to release something that like complements the brand's core range, right? They're not trying to compete directly.
Different from it. Yeah, it's not something that...
Yeah, so clearly they know that Glenlivet Spirit in sherry gets a little bit kind of doused. And, you know, their plan here is not to release these things at like age 13 and 14. It's to release them at age like 27 to 45. So you know, putting them in these like refill American hogsheads makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And that's probably what most of it went into.
And I suppose the only way they would be competing against Glenlivet is if instead of putting a vintage on the bottle, they used Roman numerals to signify the age.
I don't think we have any fear of that happening anytime soon.
Well, I mean, what would this one be? It would be XXXV, which
Yeah.
is two X's more than the Glenlivet XXV.
No, I know. Yeah, you can see why these companies had to like come to Gordon MacPhail and like cut them off because it was just like you get into these awkward scenarios. I do wonder, like this week, obviously, Spey Malt comes out again, and you know, I just picture the people that work, like they must be just like, oh my God, because I'm sure some of their customers probably come to them and ask for that.
You know, James, I think you're giving them too much credit because I mean, who is actually peddling the distillery that Spey Malt bottles? Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they're one brand within a very large company that owns its own brands. And you know, you say that, but like I don't know that they know, other than the fact that their bottlings aren't selling the way they used to.
Yeah. Hmm.
But that 76 is quite nice. But I think it's time to move on to the darkest of them all.
Yes. And boy, you talk about old school sherry. Oh my.
Well,
Is it American oak though? Can't be.
well, I mean, no, this is
The look on
refill
your face
from
was like, no, 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 you've got the wood wrong. And I'm like looking at this being like,
no, and not only that, it is also the oldest. So thinking the 77 was the oldest because it was 44 was getting the cart ahead of the horse. But oh man, I mean, this is so stewed. I
yeah,
don't
you're
know.
starting to like get those hints of like wood varnishes and like old furniture.
Well, this reminds me, I don't know why, but it immediately made me think of a coffee shop in I forget where it is, but it's the other side of the south side of the Thames,
Mhm.
uh, from Tower Bridge, because there's a whiskey exchange shop not far from there, and
Yeah, I know
there's
that.
an
I know what
out
you're talking about.
there's an outdoor market, like a food market, and it reminds me of like the smell of walking through that market while like drinking an espresso.
Well, it's funny you say that because if you, I don't know if you've ever gotten into the deep dive on espresso. Has that ever bitten you?
Uh, I mean, a little bit. I've not gone into it quite as deep as some of my staff because they've got more time on their hands than I do.
Right, like some of them have like semi-automatic machines or like even
Yeah,
manual ones. Um,
exactly.
I think when you get into that and you start like pulling espressos that are like really, really top tier, they start to some of the flavor profiles like actually come into this same realm of like old sherry cask whiskeys.
Hmm. All right, I'm zooming in because it's going to kill me. Borough Market, that's what I was thinking of.
Okay.
It's like walking through Borough Market on like after it's rained. So you've got like water in the streets. It's washed away some of the dirt of a metropolis. An
I
old
could I wouldn't disagree with someone who thought that they could smell a little, you know what petrichor is? Like the smell of like concrete that's wet. Yeah. Like there is a touch of that here.
hmm I'd say it's more cobblestones than petrichor. Cobblestones with maybe a bit of exhaust and possibly some things that shouldn't wash into the Thames, but almost certainly will.
Yep.
Lots of dark, rich fruits on this too. Like this is the like the darkest sherry we've had of anything in the lineup so far
Oh
by far.
yeah.
Very figgy. Oh man.
Okay. Yeah, I'm taking a look at this. I know what you mean now. Boy, it's a picturesque place, isn't it?
It is, it's charming in a way, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, it's it's a lived-in place.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
Loads of coffee and espresso on this. Like this is really dark, rich. Cocoa nibs, not really chocolate.
Yeah.
I mean, this is on the verge of being overcooked.
Completely.
It reminds me of a Scotch Malt Whiskey Society bottling from way back when called Close to the Edge of Extreme. Which was like I think it was an Japanese whiskey, might have even been Karazawa. That was
Oh, totally. A lot of Kurosawas are just like this, aren't they?
yeah.
They're like overcooked sherry, but there's a having worked for Glendronach, there's a type out there that's just their jam.
Mhm. Well, and as long as it doesn't stray over the edge into um like sulfur, then you're fine.
Yes, totally.
Let's see here. Was I right? I think that's what it was called. Close to, oh, you know what, James, you're gonna get a kick out of this. It was a Macallan. It was a 23-year-old Macallan from 1988, bottled by the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. Close to the edge of
Well, it's
extreme.
interesting you say that because some of the spey malts we've gotten, in particular, I want to say the second one that was 55.5%. I thought that one maybe was a bit overcooked, but
Mhm.
I know a lot of people that just like that was their favorite spey malt. And the questions I get on weeks like this when new ones come is like, how would you compare it to the 55.5 one? I'm like, I don't know.
And that could go one of two ways.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because the style I like, I think you're with me too, is like I loved that 1998 one that was more like a little bit more balanced with the sherry.
Yeah.
And I think this year's is a little bit closer to that stylistically. I think it's somewhere in the middle, but
Yeah. I haven't tried it yet, but color-wise, that's what it looks like it
it's
where
like
it's at.
halfway, right?
Well, and the people that like it's interesting, you can see it. The people that want the sherry bombs are avoiding it because they're looking at the color and it's not what they're looking for. They want something really, really
They
dark.
want this.
They want this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And interestingly, uh, as much as I find this enjoyable to drink, like it's the only one in the entire lineup that doesn't taste like the others or have it's I think
It doesn't have distillery character
it's
at
lost the
all.
distillery character,
Yeah.
but damn, it's still
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah, it's I will say this is fatiguing on the palate a little bit.
Mhm.
Like that first sip is like it's a lot of fun and
Yeah.
it's fun to nose, but it's a bit fatiguing.
I think this is the dram after which you just go back to drinking beer because your palate's ruined.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, seven Glenlivets down. Shall we go through the speed round here?
Sure.
All right. Go back, see how they fared. Does that 2004 still have a place in this lineup after 6 39+ year old whiskeys?
I just have a tiny bit left in my glass, but there's a little bit of like candy and gummies kind of coming out of it as it sits.
The nose right off the bat is like a German delicatessens cookie counter.
Yeah, wow.
So you got like the almonds and the chocolate and I don't know, some weird combination of all those things. Something like a jammy Dodger, but German.
Yeah.
Oh man.
It's just a nice dram.
Yeah.
This, by the way, is I think this one we didn't get too much into this, but I think it might be a batch of more than one cask.
Ah,
Which usually those ones that were balled at 46%, you probably remember, right? Like there was a bunch of those that came through over the years.
oh, that's
Actually,
right.
something I wish they would bring back.
I mean, think about it
Or
from the standpoint of an importer. Uh, it would make it easier for you because you can register like every time you get a new product, it's a new SKU,
yeah,
new SKU fee. Like for the retailers, we've all got to have, we've got to set it up. It's got to go on the website. It needs a description. It needs a photo. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to see maybe a few more.
well, I would specifically want it to replace the Discovery range. Like imagine if you could get that Kalila for even if it was $10 more, but it was at 46% in a connoisseur's choice bottle,
Yeah,
I think you'd have a lot more customers.
I think you're right. I think we absolutely would. It's good. It actually holds up remarkably well in a lineup that it has no business being a part of.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
1980.
80,
1980.
which I will say this thing is holding on to life barely.
Yeah.
Like is yours kind of falling apart a bit?
Mm. I mean, I'm in a much less humid place than you are, so I think it's actually faring a little better.
Yeah.
I've actually noticed that, like if I'm in
That's
Victoria or
interesting.
Vancouver, that whiskeys go cloudy very quickly there because your air is much more humid than ours.
Yeah.
And
So
it's
there's an
dry and
exchange
cold.
happening like immediately.
Mhm. To be
Like
honest,
you can tell this thing is, if I left this another hour on the counter, I think it would be dead.
this is still drinking pretty well for me in mine.
Yeah.
So I think that's environment.
Hmm. I mean, it's still delicious. It's falling apart.
Yeah. It's very light. I mean, that low ABV, 42.6. There's a reason why the people who know like things a little stronger than that if they can.
Yeah.
Nice finish to it.
What's
19,
usually the threshold, by the way, where you start to get nervous? Probably under 47.
yeah, I
Their
mean,
whiskey.
I would say under 45. I'd actually
Yeah.
be willing to go a little lower. 45 is good. Um, I mean, the converse to that though is like if I see something 40 plus years of age and it's just barely above 40% at cask strength, that also can be intriguing, especially if it's refill cask, because then you're thinking, oh man, this could be really tropical. Like
Yeah.
that's
There
the
could be
thing.
like tons of oxidation.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, like it might drink like it's even 15 years older than that.
The 1979 now is like going into, I don't know, the spinster aunt's house, and she's got like the home smells like potpourri.
Yeah, I love this bottle. There's something so wild and crazy about it. Like there's some like white chocolate, like almost like Lindor white chocolate.
If you could somehow like smoke honey, it would be like smoked honey.
Yeah, that's the honey description is good. It's got that like, yeah, what's that honey that they make in like northern Ontario from like the wild grass or whatever? It's like super
No.
funky. You have it when you're sick and you instantly feel better.
It's, you know what, surprisingly, I think that's gotten better over time, that 1979. It's
It's
at
got more
46.
savory.
It has got more savory. It's less bitter as well. Like
Yeah.
that bitter oak
Right.
edge
Yeah,
has
it got
gone.
softer. That's interesting. Do you think part of that might be, having like, for instance, gone through that 75?
I think that's part of it, but I think part of it also is oxidation. Like
Yeah.
this has now had over an hour in the glass.
It just broke down a bit.
Yeah, it's working
Yeah.
well. All right.
Okay, 78.
78.
Oh, the sherry character seems lighter now.
Mhm. More leather and tobacco on the nose than
Yeah,
before.
and like really high quality dark chocolate.
Mhm.
Espresso is still in there, but it's like it's very sweet and layered.
So chocolatey. I mean, dark milk chocolate.
Yeah, almost a touch of malted chocolate too, like that
Mhm.
what are the candies that I'm thinking of? The little
Maltesers.
hmm?
Maltesers.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Have you ever had, I mean, it's been a while since I've had this. I know I've got a buddy that makes oat milk chocolate, and he's like the oat milk chocolatier of Calgary. So I believe that makes it vegan. Um, but have you ever had goat milk chocolate, like dark goat milk chocolate?
No, but I recall someone explaining to me the chocolate that's made in Basque Country with sheep's milk and how
Yeah.
rich it is. And
Yeah.
I remember thinking like I need to try that before.
So the interesting thing was with the goat's milk chocolate, and it was goat milk, but it was dark. It almost had a gaminess to it. like in the
Yeah, well,
way that like
goat milk has really high acidity, right?
yeah. So I mean that's kind of an interesting note. So for me, it's more like a goat milk, like a dark goat milk chocolate.
Well, it's a good thing you don't write the official tasting notes.
I mean, are you suggesting that gamey and goat milk might turn people off?
I mean, just I'm gonna guess they've never put the word goat on a Gordon MacPhail bottle ever.
All right, 1977. This is to me is coming across more like a cognac now than any of the
Yeah,
other.
boy, has it ever gotten more fruity sitting in the glass.
Well, and I think acidity, you talk about that, like this has got that sort of acidic fruit note to it on the
Yeah,
nose.
totally. Yeah, it's that like that weird old-fashioned type of candy that you just can't get anymore, where
Mm.
you're like, did they use a bit of fennel seed in this?
Mhm.
I think people just used to have more savory palates.
I think if you poured this for me blind, um, it's a whiskey, but I could also be convinced that this was like a Valentursinier cognac.
Yep,
Like it's
yep.
kind of got that profile both
Yeah,
on the
I
nose and
get
the
what you're
palate.
saying.
All right, 1976. Oh man.
Yeah. Boy, this like you have to almost be careful how close you put your nose. Like it's just so aromatic.
That has got to be the most tropical of all of them, especially on the palate.
It feels like a just slightly tuned up version of the 1980.
Mhm. Alas, it was the one I had the least of, and it's gone,
Yeah.
which is kind of sad. But 1975 was
Well, at
Richard.
least this justice worked out that the 75 is the last one in the tasting.
Absolutely. Was Richard Nixon still in power in 1975? There's a thought.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Jimmy Carter was 76 to 80, right?
Hmm. Either that or was that other guy that no one remembers the
Mm-hmm.
name of.
Right. Johnson? No. Who?
No,
The
remember
intro guy.
he cameoed on The Simpsons, which was kind of
Yeah,
like
yeah, right. And he didn't run for re-election, right?
no, because he was sort of boring. Like it
Yeah.
would be like if Homer Simpson ran for,
Yeah,
except
that's who you nominate as vice president. Someone that's boring, that doesn't
yeah,
overshadow you.
yeah. Oh, God. Well, it was so long ago. So many news cycles ago. Who could keep track? All right, James, we have to do it. We got to pick favorites.
Yep.
Um, I'm a little torn on some of this actually.
I
If
feel
I'm
like there's two that for me are a half step above the others.
okay,
And
okay,
for me, that would be the 76 and the 79.
okay. I mean, I'm not surprised that's where you went. I don't disagree with the 76. Um,
Yeah, no, I totally get the 79 is a bit wild and crazy. Maybe it's the wine drinker in me because something about that reminds me of good old white Burgundy, which is something probably very few people have had these days, but it can be an experience a lot like that, where there's some like weird amalgamation of like old creamy notes and cider and
mhm.
tropical fruit, and it all just kind of like melts together in this weird concoction.
Do you have any 1980 left? Because I just went back one more time on that.
Yeah, I mean that 80, I mean mine definitely was dying, so I finished it, but
The 79 is quite tangy. But I think for me, I would be more inclined to go 76, 80, and then 78 for something a little different.
yep.
Me and that last one, I'll admit I'm possibly a little biased on.
Yeah, based on fresh crack, the 80 would be my third place, but
Mm,
after sitting in the glass longer, I would go with the 77 as my third.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. Well, that was a pretty baller range.
Yeah, we're not going to do this every time, are we?
Now, uh, we actually have a poll. Um, there's only one person who can answer it though. So we'll see if he does.
Hey, you know what? Everyone always says they want their vote to matter more. Here's Sky's opportunity.
Well, literally, Sky is the electorate. He is the entirety of the electorate here.
He is
But
both
anyways,
Supreme Court,
yeah,
Senate.
but he's struggling. The first vote is in. And the second vote is in. So let's see what we've got here.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
interesting. So I'm sharing the results. I believe only 3 of us can see it because unfortunately, if you're on Facebook, I don't think you can see the results here. But Sky chose the 1979 as his favorite, and the 1977 is his second. Now, Sky, are you a 77?
I am.
Yeah.
I am. In fact, on one of our road trips, I took a 1977 family cask out of your store. It was in the glass case, probably 2017.
Mm. In the
But
good old days, in the
in
long,
the,
long.
yeah. So, but I
Well,
did
Andrew,
enjoy.
you remember as well as I do that in 2017, people were complaining just as much about prices they are today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, that I have to admit, trying that 77 again, it might be slightly ahead of the 78. I want that 78 to
Time is doing wonders to that 77. Like if you could watch a bottle on your shelf over like a year or two, that would be the one.
Mhm. But it drinks very well. Uh, this was a fun lineup. I mean, James, I was prepared to do this even if we had the audience of 0. It
Oh,
turns
it
out
occurred to me that that was possible.
we have an audience of 4 on Facebook, which is impressive. It's been
Yep.
hovering between 3 and 4. Uh, who knows what'll get watched later, but we said at the start of the tasting, this was one of the highlights of the Rare and Old Whiskey Weekend. It was a surprise highlight for me, but I mean, I think this is a Glenlivet tasting that will be hard to beat.
Yeah, I think so too. You know what it is, Andrew, is that closed distillery tasting, there was a little bit of stuffiness and like there was like you could have heard a pin drop in the room. Like people just were so concerned about like venerating these whiskeys and giving them the treatment they deserved. This Glenlivet tasting was a little bit easier to just enjoy
Yeah.
and just kind of have fun with.
Hmm. Much as the Ben Romick tasting we're doing on, is it Tuesday?
Totally. Like I
Um,
almost had this sense during the closed distillery tasting, like I had a responsibility to like truly remember what they all tasted like, and that I needed to focus, which is a weird way to taste.
mhm. I was a bit more liberated because it was the last event of a busy
Yeah,
weekend.
right.
And it was the first one where I sat down and allowed myself to just drink everything and
Yeah.
just enjoy the moment. And it was pretty special. We will do that again at some point. There may be an event in April in the mountains worth attending somewhere. We'll just vaguely leave it at that for now. But yeah, this was the first of a couple of offshoot tastings James and I are doing from that weekend, partly because there was liquid left over and partly to help recoup the costs because it was a bit of an endeavor. But man, that Glenlivet tasting for me really stood out because I think it punched above its weight more than almost anything else that weekend. And I sincerely say I think I need to sit down and have a Glenlivet tasting in the new year at some point.
Yeah, I hear you.
A no punches pulled Glenlivet virtual tasting.
Well, you know what we need to do is put that 77 in a lineup with their core range.
Perfect. There's still 2 bottles. I'm willing to put that in there and
Amortize the cost.
absolutely. But anyway, James, I appreciate you doing this. I know this is an extra night out of your life, but it was kind
Well,
of fun
happy
to
to
go
do it.
back
Happy
to
to do it.
try them again and uh, yeah, just to get a little taste of Glenlivet. Great range. Sky is our one participant of the 13 or 14 people who bought samples to take part in the tasting. Thanks for turning out. And your
Yeah,
beer
happy to
tastes,
share birth year whiskey with you, Sky.
yeah.
Yeah. I I only clued in a few minutes after when I saw the number of 3. I thought, well, maybe the host, maybe you were letting some more people in a moment.
No, I just think
No.
everybody else who bought samples for this tasting decided not to show up tonight. It is
Uh,
December. in their
Yeah, and
defense.
it's a kind of a unique group that would have purchased this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sky, I've been trying to think all night who you remind me of with your zoom enhanced beard. I think it's that Armin Targaryen character on The Simpsons. I don't know if you remember, but he was like the really nice supervillain.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's a good look.
yeah.
Love it.
You'll see in Victoria in January. Again, I swear it's not this dark. It's the camera
Well,
and it's the lighting.
I'm gonna have to put a little Grecian formula in mine just so that I can be in the same room with you and keep my dignity. Well, anyway, James, Sky, everyone who's watching on Facebook, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the tasting. Great lineup. If we don't see you before, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, and see you in Victoria. So,
Indeed.
all right. Thanks,
All right.
guys.
See you. Good
Bye.
night.
Good night.